People like you don't belong here. The service entrance is on the side.
I have original drawings for your front desk.
I don't care what you're delivering. Take it to the side door.
Understood.
Where were we?
Graham dismissed Nolan as the kind of man who simply couldn't keep up and said it the way people say things they've never had reason to question. Kendra stepped into his car without looking back. What neither of them realized in that parking lot was that something had already shifted inside the company that employed them both. The man standing there holding divorce papers and a crying child was not exactly who they assumed. The question wasn't whether Nolan would recover from that night. The question was how long Graham had before he found out exactly who he'd just dismissed. If you've ever watched someone underestimate the wrong person, stay with this story. And if you're not subscribed yet, now's a good time. This one goes places. The parking lot outside Maplewood Elementary smelled like rain that hadn't fallen yet. Nolan Mercer stood near the back row of folding chairs the school had arranged outside for the spring showcase, still holding the program Avery had pressed into his hand that morning, the one where she'd circled her name with a green marker and drawn a small star next to it. He'd kept the chair beside him empty the whole evening. He'd told himself Kendra was just running late. By the time the last act finished, and the other parents started gathering their children, the chair was still empty. Avery had looked for her mother 3 times during the performance. Each time Nolan watched his daughter scan the crowd, I'd find only him and smile anyway. The careful smile of a child who has already learned to lower her expectations quietly so no one sees the disappointment. Nolan had been at Crestline Global Logistics for nearly 15 years. He'd started on the floor, learned the distribution systems from the ground up, and worked his way into an operations management role that gave him responsibility without recognition. He knew the facility better than anyone, every bottleneck in the loading sequence, every safety protocol, every recurring maintenance issue that got filed and quietly ignored. When something broke down in a way that stumped the regional directors, they came to Nolan. When it got fixed, the credit traveled upward. He understood how that worked, and for a long time he'd told himself it didn't matter. What Nolan couldn't have told you if asked was exactly when Kendra stopped seeing him. Not stopped loving him, that had ended earlier and more gradually in ways he'd refused to name while they were happening. But there was a difference between love fading and being erased from someone's field of vision entirely. And Kendra had crossed that line somewhere in the last 2 years without him noticing the moment it happened. She saw the uniform he wore to work. She saw the truck he drove. She saw the paycheck that covered the mortgage and the groceries and Avery's school supplies, but left nothing for the kind of life she'd begun to imagine when Graham Delaney started taking her to client dinners and asking her opinion on things. Graham was the regional director. Polished, ambitious, the kind of man who wore confidence like a second suit. He had a way of making everyone in the room feel like they were being evaluated and making certain people feel like they'd passed. Kendra was one of those people. Nolan had noticed the shift in her months ago, had told himself it was professional admiration, had chosen not to say anything, because naming it would make it real. I was still standing near the back row when Kendra appeared. Not from the direction of the parking entrance, from the far end of the lot, where a dark car had pulled quietly into a space near the gate. She was wearing something he didn't recognize, something that cost more than anything she'd bought in the last 3 years of their marriage, and she was walking the way people walk when they know they're being watched and have decided they don't care. Graham's car idled near the gate. He didn't get out. Kendra crossed the lot to where Nolan stood, and without any preamble, without even looking past him to find Avery, she held out an envelope. Her voice was flat and deliberate, the tone of someone who had rehearsed this enough times that it no longer felt like a conversation. She told him she was done. that she'd been done for longer than he'd probably realized, that she wasn't willing to keep waiting for a life that was never going to arrive, and that Graham could give her things Nolan had spent 15 years promising and never delivering. She had already signed a lease on an apartment downtown. She was moving in that weekend. Nolan took the envelope. He didn't open it. He asked about Avery. Kendra said, Avery should stay with him for now. She and Graham had commitments, travel events, meetings that required her full attention. It wouldn't be fair to uproot the child right away. She said this the way someone says something they've already decided isn't a problem, leaving no space for the obvious question of when it would become fair, or what Avery was supposed to understand about her mother choosing a dinner calendar over her. What Kendra didn't realize was that Avery had followed Nolan out of the main entrance and was standing 6 feet behind him. The child was still wearing the dress she'd performed in the hem, slightly uneven, where she'd tripped during rehearsal and caught herself. She'd heard enough. Her face held the particular expression children wear when they've understood something an adult assumed was over their head, not confusion, but a kind of still, careful processing, like watching something fall in slow motion and knowing you can't catch it. She stepped forward and asked her mother if she had done something wrong. The question came out smaller than she intended, the way a child's voice goes small when they're bracing for the answer. Kendra looked at her daughter for a moment. Then she said that sometimes adults have to choose what kind of life fits them. It wasn't an answer. It was a door closing. She turned, walked back to Graham's car, and got in without looking back. The car moved toward the exit, and then it was gone. Nolan stood in the parking lot, with the divorce papers in one hand and Avery's hand in the other. His daughter was crying, not loudly, but the restrained, exhausted kind of crying that looks like she'd been storing it up for a while and had only just allowed it. He didn't say anything immediately. He just stood there with her until the last of the other families had filtered out of the lot and the lights over the entrance clicked off one by one. He drove home in the quiet. Avery sat in the passenger seat, with her face turned toward the window. Halfway home, she asked if her dad was going to leave too. He told her no. She didn't say anything else, but she stopped looking out the window and looked at him instead, which felt like something. What neither Kendra nor Graham knew, what almost no one knew, was that 3 weeks earlier, Crestline's parent company had made a decision that hadn't yet been announced publicly or internally. The board had spent 6 months reviewing regional performance data, and somewhere in that process, they'd noticed something that didn't add up. A series of operational improvement proposals had been attributed to Graham Delaney's division proposals that had saved the company tens of millions of dollars over 5 years. But the language in those proposals, the methodology, the specific knowledge of floor-level systems didn't match Graham's background or expertise. It matched one person, the operations manager, who had been quietly filing reports that barely anyone above him had bothered to read. The board had conducted a confidential review. At the end of it, they offered Nolan Mercer the position of Global Chief Operating Officer for Crestline Global Logistics. He'd accepted. The appointment had already taken legal effect, but the announcement was being held pending a 90-day internal audit of the regional divisions, specifically the division Graham Delaney ran. Under the terms of the confidentiality agreement Nolan had signed, he couldn't tell anyone about his new role. Not colleagues, not friends, not family. He had planned to tell Kendra the night after the official announcement. He had thought he had time. The morning after Avery's showcase, Nolan sat at the kitchen table with his coffee and his laptop and opened an email that contained his first scheduling invitation as Global CO. A board meeting 3 weeks out, flagged as confidential. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he opened the envelope Kendra had handed him the night before and read through the divorce filing. He could have made one phone call that morning. One call to the board chair, one email to the legal team, and Graham Delaney's career would have ended before lunch. But Nolan had seen enough of how these situations played out to know what happened when you move too fast. If he revealed himself now, the day after his wife left him for Graham Delaney, every accusation he made would carry the taint of personal grievance. Graham's lawyers would spend months turning a fraud investigation into a jealousy narrative. The witnesses quietly cooperating with the audit would be exposed before their testimony was protected. The evidence that had taken months to build would be picked apart as the product of a scorned husband, not a legitimate corporate review. Nolan signed the divorce papers that afternoon. In the section requesting custody arrangements, he indicated that he was seeking primary custody of Avery. Then he closed his laptop, put on his work uniform, and drove to the distribution center to start his shift. To everyone watching, he was the same operations manager he'd always been. That night, Avery had trouble sleeping. Nolan found her sitting on the edge of her bed, with the lights on, not reading, not doing anything, just sitting with the particular stillness of a child whose mind is moving faster than she can process. He sat down next to her and waited. After a while, she asked if maybe her mom had left because she hadn't been good enough. She said it without drama, in the quiet, matter-of-fact voice she used when she was trying to sound like she wasn't upset about something. Nolan kept his voice level. He told her that what happened between him and her mom had nothing to do with anything Avery had done. He said, "I'm not going anywhere. Whatever else changes, that part doesn't." Avery seemed to consider this. Then she said, "Okay," and lay back down and let him turn off the light. He stayed in the doorway for a moment after she closed her eyes. The house was quiet in the way houses get quiet, when there's one less person in them, not peaceful, but emptied. Then he went to his desk, opened the encrypted file the board's legal team had sent him, and started reading. There was work to do, and no amount of personal loss changed the fact that hundreds of people depended on the outcome of that audit going the right way. He could wait. The weeks after Kendra left had a particular texture to them, not catastrophic, but relentlessly compressed. Every morning began the same way: Nolan's alarm at 5:15, a quiet move through the kitchen to pack Avery's lunch before she woke up, the careful calibration of how much time he had before the school drop-off window closed and his shift began. He'd always been organized. Now he had to be precise. There was no margin anymore. No second adult to absorb the unexpected, the lost library book, the stomachache, that wasn't serious enough to stay home but needed 10 minutes of reassurance the morning. Avery couldn't find her left shoe, and they stood in the hallway together for 4 minutes, that Nolan didn't have looking under furniture while the clock moved. He managed. He adjusted his route to work, identified which colleagues he trusted enough to ask for small favors, and started keeping a second copy of Avery's school schedule, taped to the inside of his locker at the facility. The audit work happened late after Avery was asleep, encrypted files open on his laptop at the kitchen table, cross-referencing shipping logs and vendor contracts against the figures Graham's division had been reporting to the board. He was tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep and everything to do with the sustained effort of holding two separate lives together without letting either one show the strain. Avery adapted on the surface and processed underneath. She stopped raising her hand in class for a few weeks, her teacher mentioned at a brief check-in, though she was still completing her work. At home, she was quieter in the evenings, quicker to settle into her homework, less likely to fill silences with the running commentary she'd always kept up before. She asked about Kendra occasionally, not with urgency, more the way you check a door you already know is locked, just to confirm it's still the same. Meanwhile, Graham and Kendra were performing their new life with the particular enthusiasm of people who needed an audience to make something feel real. The social media posts came steadily: restaurant dinners, a weekend trip, a photo from some corporate event where Kendra stood in a room full of people who looked like they'd never worried about a car payment. Graham had promoted her to Director of Strategic Relations, a title that appeared to involve accompanying him to events and managing relationships he didn't want to manage himself. It was the kind of job that sounds like an achievement and functions like a reward. At the distribution center, Graham became more deliberate in his treatment of Nolan. It started with scheduling. Nolan was reassigned to shifts that conflicted with the hours he'd built his life around, with no explanation given. He was excluded from the weekly operations meeting he'd been attending for 6 years, replaced by a junior manager who had been at the facility for 8 months and consistently misread the throughput data. Graham made comments in front of other staff. Nothing explicit enough to constitute a formal complaint, but the kind of commentary that lands like a verdict. He suggested in a meeting Nolan walked past with the door open that certain people in the building had reached the limit of what their capabilities allowed. Nolan absorbed it. Every action Graham took was being documented as part of the audit, and there was something almost clarifying about watching a man accumulate his own evidence so efficiently. What was harder to absorb was the day Graham's scheduling choices made it impossible for Nolan to attend Avery's end-of-semester award ceremony. He'd requested the time off 2 weeks in advance. The request came back denied without a stated reason. He showed up 40 minutes late, after arranging for a colleague to cover the first portion of his shift, and stood in the back of the school gymnasium while the other parents filed out. Avery's class had already finished. He found her in the hallway still holding her certificate, and she handed it to him without saying much. That night, she asked him a question he hadn't expected, whether she was the reason he seemed more tired than he used to be. He told her no, she was the reason he kept going, not the weight. But the question stayed with him, and he rearranged his approach after that. Less late-night work when Avery was awake. More structured evenings. He asked a colleague who'd known him for years to swap shifts on days with school commitments. Avery's teacher quietly offered to keep him updated on anything she knew in advance. And several of the workers on his floor, people whose concerns he'd actually written up and submitted when everyone told him it wasn't worth the effort, started covering for him in small ways. Nobody announced this. It just happened the way loyalty moves when it's been building for a long time. The audit moved deeper into Graham's financial operations, and what it found was layered in a way that took time to understand fully. The contracting structure was the surface layer: inflated vendor rates, high-value shipments, redirected to a logistics company, with quiet ties to Graham's extended family, fuel cost figures that didn't match any of the documented routes. Beneath that was the maintenance issue: budget cuts made to improve the division's quarterly numbers, with safety inspections still being signed off as compliant. The vehicles were running. The paperwork said they were fine. The actual maintenance records said something different. Nolan had flagged Kendra's account activity early in the process, and his first assumption had been that Graham was using her access without her knowledge, that she'd been a passive instrument, not an active participant. He held that assumption carefully because it was easier to hold than the alternative, and because he was trying to be honest with himself about the difference between what the evidence said and what he wanted it to say. Then he found the email chain. It was 3 exchanges buried in a thread about a client reporting update. Graham had told Kendra directly that certain figures needed to be adjusted before the merger documentation was finalized. He hadn't dressed it up, he'd used the word adjusted, which in context left no ambiguity about what he meant. Kendra had pushed back in her second reply, asking whether this was something they should involve compliance about. Graham's response was brief: the apartment, the car, the promotion, the merger, All of it depended on the numbers working out. If the numbers didn't work out, nothing else held together either. Her final reply was 4 words, "I'll take care of it." And she had. Her digital signature appeared on a quarterly compliance report that Nolan now knew with documented certainty contained figures she understood were false. I was sitting at this kitchen table when he confirmed it, Avery asleep down the hall after waking from a bad dream an hour earlier. He'd sat with her until she settled, talking quietly about nothing in particular, until her breathing evened out. When he came back to the table and opened the file and found what he found, he sat with it for a long time. He thought about the email, about the 4 words, about the choice Kendra had made in the moment when the choice was clearest. And he thought about a fleet of trucks running routes across 4 states, maintained on falsified records, driven by people who had no reason to suspect anything was wrong. The audit had started as an institutional review. That night it became something more urgent. Graham moved first, which meant he moved imprecisely. He'd noticed that someone inside the facility was accessing records in patterns that didn't fit normal operations, pulling historical vendor contracts, cross-referencing maintenance logs that had no reason to be connected. He set a trap. A classified contract document was placed in a shared directory that Nolan's credentials could reach in a location that only someone actively looking would find. When Nolan's account accessed it in the course of a routine audit sweep that the board's legal team had authorized and logged, Graham brought the evidence to the facility's security team and reported unauthorized data access. The suspension happened in front of the entire floor. Security walked Nolan through the building and out through the main entrance while 30 people watched. Someone recorded part of it on a phone. The video made its way through the facility's internal messaging channels by the end of the day. Kendra saw it by that evening. With a legal team Graham had arranged and paid for, she filed for primary custody of Avery. The filing cited Nolan's sudden unemployment, the suspension pending investigation, and Graham's financial stability as relevant factors in determining the most suitable environment for the child. It was a precise document. It had been written by people who understood how to make a grievance look like a concern. Nolan understood what it was immediately. This was not about Avery. Kendra had not suddenly discovered a maternal urgency that required her to restructure her life around a daughter she'd left in a parking lot 2 months earlier. This was pressure a lever designed to make him stop or slow down or accept a settlement that buried everything he'd found. If he was fighting a custody case, he was distracted. If he was distracted, the audit collapsed. Avery heard the adults talking about the possibility that she might have to move in with her mother. Nolan hadn't meant for her to hear it. It was a phone call with his attorney conducted in the kitchen while he thought she was in the shower, but she'd come down the hall and caught enough of it to understand the general shape. That night, he went to check on her and found a small backpack tucked under the far edge of her bed frame, partially hidden by the bedskirt. Inside 3 outfits folded neatly her most worn library book and a small photograph of her and Nolan from a trip to the state park the summer before, the one where she'd insisted on carrying the trail map and led them in the wrong direction for 20 minutes before admitting she'd been reading it upside down. I didn't say anything about the backpack. He sat down on the floor next to her bed, picked up the library book, and read to her until she fell asleep. When he turned the light off and stepped into the hallway, he stood outside her door for a moment and let the reality of what Avery was carrying settle into him fully. She had packed a bag because she was afraid someone would come for her without warning. She was 9 years old, and she had developed a contingency plan. The witness who had been closest to the financial irregularities withdrew his cooperation the week before the board's scheduled review. He sent a brief message to the legal team stating that he was no longer in a position to participate. Nolan didn't need to be told why. Graham had reached him through channels that didn't leave fingerprints, and the message had been effective. At the same time, Crestline's senior leadership began applying pressure to conclude the audit ahead of schedule. The merger that Graham's division had been building toward was close to finalization, and the board members who stood to benefit from it were not inclined to welcome complications. Graham called Nolan directly. He was civil about it, which was somehow worse than contempt would have been. He explained in the measured tone of a man who believed the conversation was a formality that there was a straightforward path available. Nolan could withdraw his cooperation with the audit, relinquish the custody dispute, and in return, Graham would ensure the suspension was reversed, his professional reputation was restored, and a financial arrangement was made that would let him relocate and start over somewhere else. He said it as if he were doing Nolan a favor. Nolan declined. He didn't elaborate. He ended the call. The notice arrived the following morning. Morning and emergency custody hearing scheduled for 8 o'clock, less than 12 hours away. The board meeting was at 10. 2 appointments, 2 hours apart, both of them capable of determining the shape of everything that came next. He read the notice twice, then set it on the kitchen table next to his coffee and looked at it for a long moment. That night, Nolan sat beside Avery's bed again after another nightmare brought her partway awake. She asked him in the drowsy, unguarded way children ask things when they're not fully conscious, whether her mother could use money to take her away from him. He told her no. He told her that wasn't how it worked. But sitting there in the dark, after she drifted off again, he understood that he'd been fighting this battle in the dark for long enough. The silence that had protected the investigation was now the same silence teaching his daughter to be afraid. He opened his closet and took out the suit he'd bought for the board meetings, the one he hadn't worn yet, still in the dry cleaning bag. He hung it on the door. Then he sat back down at the kitchen table and spent the next 2 hours making sure every document the board needed was organized, transmitted to the legal team, and time-stamped. Tomorrow he would walk into that board meeting as himself fully and without any further delay. Before he turned off the light, he looked in on Avery one more time. He knelt down beside her bed, low enough to be at eye level if she'd been awake, and told her quietly that no one was going to turn her into a prize in someone else's argument. When Nolan's attorney called that morning to confirm the 8 o'clock hearing, the judge had already received an emergency motion from Nolan's legal team. Attached to the motion was a time-stamped summary of the audit record, not its contents, but its existence and its verified chain of custody, along with a formal notice that the plaintiff's lead counsel had a direct financial relationship with the party under corporate investigation. The judge granted a 2-week continuance before 8 o'clock. By 8:15, Nolan was back at the kitchen table making Avery's breakfast. He made the same breakfast he made every morning: eggs toast, the orange juice she liked, poured into the cup with the blue handle. Avery came downstairs in her school clothes and sat across from him, and they ate without talking much, the way they did on mornings when the day ahead felt large. When it was time to go, he drove her to school, the same way he had every other morning, the same route, the same stop for the light, at the corner of Birchwood and 5th, the same radio station Avery liked that played songs he didn't know the names of. She grabbed her backpack, the regular one, not the one from under the bed, and jumped out of the car, then turned back and knocked twice on the window. He rolled it down. She told him she'd saved him a seat at the spring reading night next Thursday. He told her he'd be there. Then he drove home, changed into the suit, and headed downtown. Graham arrived at the Crestline corporate offices at 9:40, Kendra beside him. They came in through the main entrance, through the glass corridor that led to the executive conference suite on the 14th floor. Graham had been in this building before for regional reviews. He knew which seat the regional directors were expected to take when the board convened. He'd been told the meeting agenda included a merger update and a discussion of regional leadership structure, which he'd interpreted as confirmation of what he'd been expecting for the better part of a year, his formal elevation into a senior executive role as the company expanded. Kendra had dressed for the occasion. She stood beside Graham in the corridor with the posture of someone who had earned the right to be in a room like this. She believed Nolan was somewhere across town, presenting himself to a judge as an unemployed man with a suspended badge and no legal team to match the one Graham had retained. She had no reason to think otherwise. The conference room door was already open when they arrived. Several board members were seated reviewing documents. The chair at the head of the table, the one that faced the door, the one that commanded the room, was occupied. Nolan sat there in a dark suit, a folder open in front of him, speaking quietly with the board's legal counsel. He looked up when Graham and Kendra entered, and his expression didn't change. Graham stopped walking. The recognition took a moment, not because Nolan looked different, but because the context made no sense to him. His mind tried to fit what he was seeing into a frame that would explain it, and kept failing. Nolan was in the wrong seat. Nolan was supposed to be a man who'd lost everything Graham had taken from him, and instead he was sitting at the head of a board table like someone who had been sitting there for months. The board chair stood and addressed the room. She explained for the record that Nolan Mercer had been appointed Global Chief Operating Officer of Crestline Global Logistics, effective 7 weeks prior, following a confidential review process conducted by the parent company. His authority over all regional operations, including the authority to evaluate, suspend, and terminate regional directors, had been in full effect since the date of appointment. Graham said there had to be a mistake. He said Nolan worked in the warehouse. He said Nolan was a floor manager who reported to him. Nolan waited until Graham finished. Then he said clearly and without any particular emphasis that on the surface level, Graham was correct. For several weeks, he had continued operating under his previous title to complete a confidential audit of the regional division. But from the date of his appointment forward, the reporting structure had reversed. Graham had been reporting to him whether Graham knew it or not. The room went quiet in the way rooms go quiet. When something shifts and everyone present understands that the shift is permanent. Nolan opened the folder. He told the story the way it had actually unfolded, not as a list of charges, but as a sequence of choices, each one leading to the next. The vendor contracts that showed one routing arrangement on paper and another in practice. The money that moved through consulting accounts that existed only to receive it. The fuel costs logged against routes that GPS records contradicted. The maintenance budget cuts executed gradually timed to the quarters where margin pressure was highest, while safety inspections continued to be filed as passing. As Nolan moved through each layer, he watched Graham's face go through the specific progression of a man whose calculations have stopped producing useful results. Graham leaned forward, and when he spoke, his voice had the controlled steadiness of someone spending visible effort to hold it steady. "You're doing this because I took your wife." Nolan reached into the folder and placed a single document on the table, the audit initiation record issued by the parent company's legal team, with the date printed clearly in the header. The date was 22 days before Avery's school showcase. 22 days before Kendra had walked across a parking lot and handed him an envelope. He let everyone in the room do the arithmetic themselves. Then he looked at Graham and said, "This investigation started before she chose you." Graham had no follow-up. The thing that makes a threat useful is the possibility that the other person might not be certain, might be bluffing, might fold under pressure. Nolan wasn't bluffing. Every document in that folder had been verified by an independent auditor and stored with a third party. There was no version of the day where the evidence became a personal grievance rather than a corporate record. Nolan then described the truck. One of the vehicles running on falsified maintenance clearances had experienced brake failure on a delivery route 2 nights prior. The driver had identified something wrong early, a pull in the pedal response he didn't recognize and pulled over rather than continuing. An inspection found that the brake system required repairs that had been due for 60 days and signed off as completed. The driver's decision to stop had prevented a serious accident. This was not a matter of financial irregularity anymore. People had been put at risk. The protection of a merger timeline had been treated as more important than the safety of the workers running the routes. Nolan suspended the merger, pending full review, terminated Graham Delaney's contract on the grounds of documented misconduct, and directed that the complete audit file be transmitted to the relevant regulatory authorities. He said this without raising his voice, the way you say something that has already been decided and simply needs to be stated for the record. Kendra had not spoken since entering the room. When Nolan announced her suspension pending investigation into her role in the compliance documentation, she looked at him and said she needed him to separate what had happened between them personally from what was happening in this room. Nolan told her he hadn't been the one to mix them together. Graham had used her account credentials to execute a fraud scheme and kept her compliant by making her comfort depend on its success. She had then used the resources Graham provided his lawyers, his leverage, to threaten his custody of their daughter. The personal and the professional had been combined the moment they decided his job, his reputation, and his relationship with Avery were appropriate tools in a business dispute. He wasn't separating anything. He was finishing what they had started. I was not punishing them for betraying him. He was holding them accountable for what they had done to the company, to the workers, and to the people on those roads. In the weeks that followed, the structure Graham had built came apart at the speed of things that were always fragile underneath. The witnesses who had withdrawn cooperation began coming forward again once it was clear Graham no longer had the institutional protection to make threats credible. The financial irregularities attracted regulatory attention that moved faster than the internal process had. Graham's assets were frozen during the investigation. The professional network he'd spent years building evaluated the situation quickly and quietly withdrew. Kendra lost the directorship, the apartment, and the relationships that had only ever been adjacent to Graham's position rather than her own. When the legal and financial arrangements that had made the relationship possible were no longer available, the relationship itself proved to be made of the same material. She and Graham spent the weeks following the board meeting redirecting blame toward each other in the efficient way that people do when they've run out of external targets. The family court received the audit documentation, including the evidence that the suspension had been engineered and the custody filing had been timed to coincide with the investigation's critical period. The judge reviewed Kendra's extended absence from Avery's daily life, the timing of the filing, the use of Graham's legal resources, and found that the petition did not reflect the child's best interests. Nolan retained primary custody. Kendra was granted a visitation schedule structured and consistent with a specific provision that Avery could not be used in any future financial or legal dispute between the parties. At Crestline, Nolan restructured first. The maintenance budget was restored. Workers who had been formally penalized for raising safety concerns received written apologies and back pay where it was owed. A confidential reporting channel was established with a third-party administrator. Several people who had been passed over for promotion in favor of Graham's preferred candidates were reevaluated, and most of them advanced. The changes were institutional, not performative. They didn't require an announcement. The workers who had watched Nolan be walked out of the building by security a few weeks earlier watched him walk back in as the person who now ran the company. He came in through the employee entrance. He remembered names. He stopped to talk to the woman who ran the second shift handoff the same way he'd always stopped, because she knew the floor better than anyone and usually had something worth hearing. Several months after the board meeting, Nolan was standing outside Avery's school waiting for dismissal when Kendra appeared. She stopped near him and told him she'd convinced herself Graham represented a version of life she deserved. She'd believed that. Then she said that if she had known about his position, if she had known what he actually was inside the company, she never would have left. Nolan listened to the whole thing. And when she finished the thing, he understood most clearly was that the apology and the admission in that last sentence were not the same statement. She was sorry about the outcome. She regretted the man she had chosen. But the logic of her regret was still the same logic she'd been running on the night she'd handed him the envelope. She had made a calculation, and the calculation had turned out to be wrong. She wasn't describing a changed set of values. She was describing a better informed version of the same ones. He told her that a marriage couldn't be saved by a title someone had been keeping private. If respect only arrived once you knew the other person had power, then it was never respect to begin with. She didn't respond. He didn't expect her to. The school doors opened, and Avery came out, and the conversation became something else. 3 weeks later, Crestline held a public event to announce the new Worker Safety Initiative, a restructured inspection protocol, an independent oversight board, and a compensation fund for workers affected by the previous administration's maintenance failures. It was held at the distribution facility in the main floor space they'd cleared for the occasion. Several hundred employees attended. Nolan was in the corridor backstage before it started reviewing his notes when Avery, who had come with him and been doing homework on a folding chair in the corner, walked over and straightened his tie with the careful, concentrated expression she wore when she was taking something seriously. Then she looked up and asked whether Mr. Graham knew yet that her dad was actually his boss. Nolan smiled and told her it didn't matter anymore. What mattered was that the people who hadn't had a voice before now had someone making sure they were protected. Avery took his hand, and they walked toward the stage together. He stepped into the light in front of the crowd, not as a man who had beaten anyone, not as someone collecting what was owed to him, but as a person who had decided at the lowest point of those long months that the right thing to protect wasn't his reputation or his pride, but the work and the people the work was supposed to serve. Wealth can make a person look powerful, but how they treat the people who have nothing to offer them, that's what reveals who they actually are. Kendra had chosen the appearance of success and lost everything that was real. Nolan had chosen responsibility, consistency, and a little girl who'd never once thought he was a failure, and that turned out to be more than enough. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs the reminder that quiet people are worth paying attention to. And if you haven't subscribed yet, join us. There's a lot more where this came from.